Sorry, I needed to share screen before I did that. Come on.
Super, thank you. So I just press, this is slightly different, I'll page down, yeah? That one? Yep,
Yeah.
Good, okay. Thank you very much for having us. So I'm kicking off. Basically what we're doing is what you see here on the slide. We'll be looking at trying to sort of get to the bottom of the public assumptions about language and value, but particularly, well, a little bit about the fallout of that, but most importantly, how more effectively to get the message across. And most importantly too, and this is, I think, a significant part of getting the message across, is also acknowledging or, even piggybacking on the incredibly vibrant discourse that's already out there in the public about language. And we also hope too that this is going to have some bit of interest to science communication generally. Arrogantly, we think it might have something to say for science communication in general. So what we're doing here is looking at, or what we've done is to examine, we loosely actually, Howie and Simon have done this work, look at the conversation articles that you see here, written by linguists, well, written by us, but written by us, I importantly add, well before we were looking at this. So, and looking, of course, at the comments, we also draw on the feedback, many years of engaging with the public, either radio or telly. I think everyone knows what the conversation is, but it's, obviously it's an example of explanatory journalism where, obviously researchers, university people post directly to the public. So these are the, shall I move the head up or something? So these are the articles we looked at. Thanks, such a deal. Articles we looked at, as you can see, it's a mixture of hot button issues and some less hot button issues, and how we will be talking to that, and so will Simon later. The comments, well, they don't really, well, sometimes they relate to the hot buttonness of the issues, but, and Howie's done some study of this, when you release the article to the conversation, it will have a bearing on how many people read it. So don't ever publish your article on a Friday afternoon or on a Friday, because it's guaranteed not to get many reads. Okay, so what is this thing called truthiness? Well, it's not the 19th century term truthiness, which was a sort of very short-lived synonym for truthfulness. This is, I suppose it joins one of the many in the modern Orwellian word hoard of, post-truth and alternative facts and fake news. And truthiness is, in fact, the brainchild of Stephen Colbert. We don't have an image of him now. It's best known really in the context of political misinformation. And this was my first really encounter with full-on truthiness. A fairly memorable time where, and some of you might have seen this interview too, where Pauline Hanson was challenged on her idea that, 1 million illegal immigrants were entering Australia each year. And her reply was, well, but you're just asking for book facts. We don't need book facts. We know it's happening. So as Colbert said, truthiness is something you find in your gut. You don't find it in books. So sort of we're extending the notion of truthiness to language. So I'm going to give you some truthy accounts of language, and apologies because these are sort of oldies. This first one particularly, and I'm sorry if I've talked about it before, but it's a nice one because it's on yeah, no. And it also speaks to, goes to the heart of the problem really of linguistic communication. It was quite a lengthy piece, opinion piece on discourse markers. And what was interesting about this piece was that David Campbell had obviously read the linguistic research on this and beautifully laid out, I thought, what the discourse marker was doing, but then just dismissed it all. Well, why? Because he knew that yeah, no served no useful purpose. So even when you think you're getting the message across, people often then just fall back on their sort of common sense knowledge of what they know to be true. So that, as it says here, yeah, no is just another example of speech junk, unnecessary words that clutter up our language. And sorry, Lauren, I put this one in. I know you never wanted to hear the name of Dean Frenkel ever again, but this is also an interesting one. This is, some of you will have seen it, a 2-page spread in The Age, tracing the Australian accent back to the drunken speech of those early English speakers. I've just given you a few little choice bits from there. And it's interesting, 2 reasons. One is, well, I might have a deep passion in astrophysics, but I'm not going to get a 2-page spread in The Age, am I? Or a gig on the science show, and nor should I. But this doesn't stop people from writing about language. So Dean Frenkel, with no background in phonetics or historical linguistics, felt free to make these claims. But also interesting was the fact that the press, and this went all around the world, not surprisingly, because it's about, drunken Australians, and it just sort of fitted what people imagined for us. But no one was interested in listening to linguists, even eminent linguists like David Crystal. In fact, he's written a blog about this where he said that the world press just kind of lapped it up and repeated it as if it were gospel. What did they say? They quoted Crystal, but it was simply, David Crystal says that, there's a lot of diversity in the English-speaking world, so it looked like David Crystal was actually supporting what Frenkel was saying. So there are all sorts of challenges in getting this message across, and some of them we share with, other science communicators, of course, but we do have this problem that, I suppose it's a lack of brand identity, or whatever they say in marketing. People don't really know what linguists do, and that can be a real barrier in the law and in education. And it's a problem because, if you're trying to get the message across, if you make it look too complex, then it gets, dismissed as quackery, or, poor old Georgina Hayden, her very nice syntactic analysis was described as junk science of the worst kind by a judge when she presented it in court. Well, and you make it look too simple, it just looks like everyone can do it. And the fact is, as it says there, we're dealing with the everyday, so it really does look like it doesn't involve necessary expertise. The other thing is we are often misinterpreted, me routinely by my own family members, of pushing this kind of anything goes agenda. And we, linguists know better than anyone that it's anything goes. And we also criticised, and I've certainly had a few grumpy emails about this, that we're pushing this agenda from our very privileged positions, that we got there precisely because we knew about the finer points of, the placement of the apostrophe. So, it's tricky. And language issues are often these hot button issues that, have to do with, of course, social standing and identity and people's stories about the world. And as you well know, we've seen a bit of this lately, people's worldviews do kind of get in the way of them thinking rationally about things. So it can be a problem. And it's even more dangerous territory too, as those people who are involved in myth busting show there are these backfire effects that can happen. So if you present people with, the linguistic evidence in this case, then that can just simply make those myths that you're trying to bust more deeply entrenched. And of course, it's precisely these hot button issues is where those backfire effects are more likely to take place. So, everyone has opinions about language, of course, and, we all love the fact that the public are passionate about language. We could draw on that. And there's no problem with having opinions, of course, but it's when these opinions are put above, well-researched linguistic evidence that the problems happen. And you're well aware of the problems, in a lot of environments, obviously in education and, people's employment possibilities, and in the law particularly. And I've just given a couple of quotes there from Georgina Hayden and Helen Fraser. I won't read them because we're a bit short of time, but I put Peter Gray there. He is a kind of hero for me because he was a former federal court judge, and he is someone who thinks that lawyers need to know about linguistics, and he's actually not that long ago finished his own Masters of Applied Linguistics, which was fabulous. So, and he's written as well at length about the legal distrust of linguists, that it looks like something anyone can do. And of course, lawyers are well versed in language. Okay, and yes, it says there that not even clear that there's a discipline called linguistics. Okay, so how do we give these facts a fighting chance? The earlier slide mentions knowing stuff isn't enough, and that was in fact one of the headlines of the flurry of articles in the press after Brexit and after Trump. Knowing stuff isn't enough, and it was clear with the yeah/no paper. They're just laying out the linguistic facts. Facts don't speak for themselves. So this lovely quote here that is one that Howie dug up from, it's Rebecca Huntley. Is that Rebecca Huntley, who's one of the many science communicators who's addressing this? How do you get the message across to people who are facts adverse? And this is a lovely quote. She's writing about climate change here. We need to stop being reasonable and start being emotional. More science isn't the answer. People are the solution, namely understanding how they work as rational and emotional, messy and inconsistent, ingenious herd animals. Also, we think that it's this, oversimplified prescription-description dichotomy that's been getting in the way. I mean, I'm not suggesting that linguists go out and embrace pointless rules like don't, end sentences with prepositions. But when you pit prescription against description in the way that we have been doing, that really is not helpful. If we want to change the common knowledge that people have about language, then we have to take seriously, and examine carefully the assumptions that people have about language and the concerns that they have for the well-being of their language. And only that way will we be in a better position for getting the message across, because of course we do view language very differently. Anyway, I think, is it Howie now? Yes.
Just very quickly, I wanted to say that we're not alone in this desire to communicate science, and also there's a long history of philosophy of science and practice of science communication, but we wanted to briefly pick up with where we are relative to the most recent phase, which is the public understanding of science model. Now, this is something that's been happening since the 1960s, and it's this idea that we are the experts in our lab, and we come up with these ideas, our science, our findings, and then we distribute them to the community. So we're upstream, and then as our facts go downstream, they typically end up, they typically end up becoming diluted because the media dilutes them. We sometimes dilute them to make them a little simpler for take up, and of course when we dilute them, one person's dilution is another person's atrocity, so we come into issues with this. But there's obviously been a change in recent years because of the internet, because of the growth of media, where there's a certain democratization of science, whether we like it or not. And because there is a democratization of science, we have to maybe think about, well, in public discourse, when we go out, how do people know? And who are they when they know? We should unpack who they are, because this might actually help us better connect with them. So Myers in discourse studies points out that whenever we go out, we become more lay, or at least sometimes people think of us as more lay, so we have to take this into account. The other thing that becomes relevant here is, well, how do we know? How are we conveying our knowledge? And to what degree are different kind of epistemic senses of knowledge actually respected or not respected, or need to be fleshed out? So we wondered, we wish that there was some kind of science which could go out and look at language and better understand how to connect with audiences, and we discovered that indeed there is. Here we are as linguists. So that's what we're going to talk about today, some of the work that we've been doing, preliminary work to better understand, well, who are we through pronouns in interaction, but also how do we know in interaction? So for now, I'll turn it over to Simon.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here is the actual language data from the material from the conversation and the comments threads. And what we're trying to get at here is what kind of stances are people taking and what kind of voices are being contributed to these discussions. So what we're looking at essentially here is first person pronoun use, singulars and plurals. And we're summing across all the different forms. So I, me, my, we, us, our get treated the same. And you can see a very unsurprising thing, which is Sorry, and I should say that the authorial material contains the original articles plus any comments contributed by the authors into the discussion, and the comments is everything not written by the original authors. Okay, so unsurprisingly, you know, we grew up with the academic discourse model. We tend not to use first-person pronouns, even when we're writing for the conversation. We don't totally avoid them, but we use them less than the commenters. The other thing that's interesting here is that for the contentious material, we're seeing that the first person singular is used a bit more and plurals used a bit more for the non-contentious. So there's a more communal voice apparent when people are discussing stuff that's less contentious. If they think it's more contentious, or if that's how they're experiencing it, they're more likely to put forward a very personal opinion. And just reinforcing this, looking just at the first person plural frequencies, we can see the same kind of thing, that the authors use first person a bit less, and there's a difference between a communal voice being contributed when you're talking about something more contentious. But what's actually going on in more detail? Well, first of all, let's have a look at what Our is doing in the non-contentious material. You can see that there's, although the authors used it a little bit more, the usage is spread a lot. So there's quite a lot of different things that are being identified as Our. In terms of what's happening, more general patterns, what intrigued me, that was only one bigram, Our plus something else, that the authors used more than once in our material, and it was Our Beloved, which came as quite a surprise. So you can see the examples here, Our Beloved Tracky Dacks and Our Beloved Strine Slang. There were quite a lot of others, but that was the only one that recurred. On the other hand, for the commenters, there are these 9 bigrams that occurred more than once. The amount of material is different, right? So 2 occurrences in the author's smaller corpus is comparatively as great a rate of occurrence as 4 or 5 in this larger corpus. So only the first 3 here are actually comparatively as prominent as the Our Beloved was for the authors. So, but you can see that this is quite a focused group, right? So there's our language, our slang, Australian country culture, our home. People are focusing on identity issues here. And we can look at some of the examples. We can guard our language. Do we want to leave our language to the lovies? We can give our own stamp to the most fixed words in our language. It's thoroughly imprinted on our language. People are really feeling ownership in this, and it's in this communal voice. Same kind of thing with our slang. I won't go through these examples. We're seeing similar phenomenon. People feel some kind of ownership of this, and they're expressing it. And particularly, I think the our own examples reinforce this. What is it that's our own? Well, our own purposes. We can give our own stamp, our own variety. And the authors had only one example of this diagram, which was actually negative, something that isn't our own. So the commenters have this strong kind of communal message coming through. There are things that we value as a group, and we're expressing that with our pronoun use. The most common bigram with we for the, most common, but the most interesting one is we can. And it was the 5th most common of the authors, 7th most common with commenters, but doing different things. So when the authors are using we can, they're actually talking about how the interaction works generally. And I'll show you the example in a second. But the commenters are actually talking about agency. These are things that we can do. So the examples from the authors are things like, we can but invite you to contribute. Or we can also look at results. We can give you a teaser. This is about how the discourse, how the interaction is developing, right? But in contrast, commenters are things like, we can do what we please. We can erode the imperial out of the US cultural machine. Someone stuck in the 60s, I think. We can guard our language. So this is really about what this community can do in relation to the issues that are being discussed. The contentious material, so that was all about, okay, the non-contentious stuff. The contentious material where people are more likely to have the personal I, we still get our, but we see an interesting, I mean, it relates also to what material was, but an interesting focus. And what's very prominent here is talk about language and particularly the sounds of language, right? So we've got our accent, our diction, pronunciation, our speech, and the authors also our accents. As I said, this is partly due to the way that the conversation's developed in the original topics, but it's a very specific focus there. And for we, it's not so clear that there's anything distinct going on. And that's not surprising because we've already seen from the basic numbers, this communal voice is less prominent in this material. But what is interesting is that rather than we can, the modal diagram that comes up here with the commenters is we should. So now they're not talking about what's possible, what their agency is. They're talking about enjoining a community. What are the actions that we should take rather than what's possible for us to do? We can is in there, but there was no real pattern about what was happening with it. So to summarize very briefly that, non-contentious material, we've got more of a communal voice being expressed, and ownership and agency are the stance. We own these resources and we can do things with them, we can guard them, we can protect them. But in the contentious material, there's less of that communal voice. If we're talking about ownership, it's focused very much on the sound of language, and the actions are not about agency and possibility, but about what should be done. Okay, back to Howie.
Thanks. Thanks, Simon. So let's look at the stances and the kinds of stances that get taken in the article and maybe try to have a better understanding of maybe what works, what doesn't, where does the conversation go forward, where does it break down, and yeah, in general, what are some things that we might be missing about the discussions that we have with the public. So focusing on this, people often think about stance as an agreement or a disagreement, but in fact, it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. We need to pay attention to the nuance of that. So for instance, in this instance, we see Ken saying, I would love to go, and Joanne says, I want to go, from Dubois 2007. These aren't the same stance. They're not agreeing with each other. There's actually a bit of difference. And this is really useful for understanding the way that people discuss things in the conversation and public discourse. Even when people think that they agree or seem to be agreeing, they're not necessarily agreeing. Even when people seem to be disagreeing, they're not necessarily disagreeing. So let's start by talking about scale and stance object. Stance object being you and I, we have our ideas about something, some kind of stance object like this presentation, and we negotiate and we align in relation to this stance object. Now, one thing to note in the data that we see is that the bigger the stance object is, the big kind of massive sense of a stance object, the less likely it is that actually the conversation is going to go forward. People get stuck in idling mode and sometimes even end up with big disagreements. So we can take something like Australian slang, which is a very big, broad topic, our non-contentious topic that we've been talking about here. And if people start arguing about Australian slang, they get nowhere. You know, Jace, they get absolutely nowhere the vast majority of the time. So here we have somebody take a stance that Australian slang is racist and sexist, and we should stop using it. And this immediately leads to this stance. Nah, it's not racist, I won't. And this goes nowhere. And this is actually something that happens with these sorts of conversations. If you start with a big, broad idea, you try to discuss that idea, it's not going to go anywhere at all. So what we do notice is the smaller the idea and kind of the more nuanced the idea, the more collaboratively people actually engage with the idea. And we saw one bit that actually exemplified this was money terms. There was a discussion in one of our articles that was arguing that, you know, Australian slang isn't dying, and it's definitely not being Americanized the way that everybody thinks that it's being Americanized. And somebody popped up and said, well, you know, one place where in fact it has gone west is with money terms. So this person posts this comment under our discussion, and this led to a 400-word post by this person, which is great because, I mean, our articles are what, like 800 to 1,000 words. This guy wrote half a conversation article about this. But what's interesting about this, this discussion and what this guy did was he drew on a wide range, we create this monolithic idea of who the public are and how they're using knowledge. But actually, if you take a closer look at what they're pulling together lots of little bits of information. So this guy begins by talking or drawing on Australian knowledge, this idea that at a certain point, the currency changed just as a social change in Australia. Then he goes and shifts into some personal knowledge. Oh, I remember back in the day when, 100 quid was a ton, just like 100 miles per hour, miles per hour. Sorry, briefly got lost in the metric imperial thing. But then he goes on to actually use two different sources in his big, long, half a conversation article here. One of those sources we would, as linguists, probably think of as a strong epistemic source, the Macquarie Dictionary. And this bloke seems to know as much, calling it the August Macquarie Dictionary. But also, because he couldn't find new terms, he went out and searched some. He tried to discover some, and sure enough, he found a website where they did have new slang terms for money. So again, the public are actually not as kind of just publicly as we would think they are. They're actually quite diverse, and they're drawing on diverse knowledge. And I won't go through all of these discussions because they just kind of reaffirm this point that actually you have a lot of people responding to them. And it's this wonderful long conversation of people drawing on what we would think of as strong epistemic sources, weak epistemic sources. Sometimes people use the weak sources and come up with the right answers, where the strong sources don't actually give them the answers. So it's a very complicated kind of process of, to go back to my earlier point, alignment and calibration. So we need to pay closer attention to these sorts of things. So the summary of this section is ultimately that people generally don't agree or disagree. They spend a lot of time calibrating, and we need to pay closer attention to the way that they calibrate. Stance focus is important, whether it's a big topic or a small topic will actually influence the degree to which it goes forward. People are more clued in than we often give them credit for. And this includes the fact that they know what a strong source is, they know what a weak source is sometimes, and sometimes people stumble into the right answer with the weaker source. So it's worth paying attention to these things when we engage with them. What's that? Which ones are the left?
They're people who work for the ABC.
Yeah. So going on to the second subpoint here, cultural identity and epistemic authority, right? I mentioned, as Myers did, that whenever we go into the public, we become more lay in the eyes of the public. We're out and about, and they don't always recognize us as the epistemic authority, the experts. So what ends up happening here with cultural identity and fixed thought oftentimes is there be dragons. It could be really, really tricky when we're going out, because cultural identity is a place where people get quite triggered, people are quite fixed, and this is where people can be more difficult to actually move. Now, what I want us to think about, and what a lot of other sciences are actually thinking about these days, are that we like to think of descriptivists or prescriptivists or different kinds of people in the community, where a lot of sociology studies and political studies are actually showing that it's important to micro-target these days and to think of really specific demographics, and the idea that we need to be approaching specific demographics in different ways. So the famed sociological study, The Hidden Tribes of the USA, proposes that there are in fact 7 tribes in the USA. 3 of those tribes are immovable, and that you shouldn't even bother with those tribes. But that leaves actually, 67% of America, or whatever it is, Australia, that we might be able to move. Now, getting back into the data, we have to keep an eye, as I said, on the emotional underpinnings of cultural identity. And this commenter is a great example of the extremes, somebody that we won't necessarily move. So according to the linguist, it's perfectly fine to call apples oranges, even worse, orangas. This, and it goes on and on. We'll call this commenter Peen Drenkel, just to use pseudonym. But it gives us the worst case scenario of somebody that we're probably not going to move, this type of person. We also come across kind of similar people. This commenter, actually, almost every comment this person made was related to religion and the idea that swearing, this was on one of Kate's swearing articles, that it was tied into morality and it was just bad and would cause society to decline, blah, blah, blah. And there was, and you could watch this person interacting with other people with big ideas, you know, swearing is bad, evil, you'll go to hell. There was no convincing this person of otherwise. Now, to kind of illustrate too this idea of epistemic authority not being assumed, this example shows this quite well, I think. Now, this is my fault. For the word Grammy, there are 3 etymologies that are out there. One of those etymologies is the little things that you put in your ear. The other etymology is that it's the Australian version of the American Grammy, a novice surfer. And the third etymology is nautical. The third etymology probably isn't very likely. So what happened was when we were researching this article, I took on the surfing bit. I looked in surfy magazines, and the surfy magazines were actually coming down really hard on the Grammy thing. So what is this? About 20 words. I chose an etymology. I was wrong. I wasn't wrong, but like I went hard on one etymology where I shouldn't have gone hard on one etymology. Somebody picked us up on this in the comments. Totally reasonable thing to have picked up in the comments. Incorrect etymology. Young surfers who spent much time in the water had ear infection. Surfers' ear that required that they wore grommets, hence the term grom. So Kate came in and gave a very extensive explanation, an excellent explanation with those 3 etymologies, but also pointing out that oftentimes when a slang term survives, it is because there are multiple etymologies pushing it along, these little etymological bitsers, as Kate says. Wonderful explanation, I think so, it's my professional opinion. Which, of course, the commenter took up with great gusto. No, the etymology of grom is clear, singular, and as I have stated above. And it gives lots of information about this based on what we presume is his background as a surfer. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. We can only presume here, but there's a really interesting story with this Australian surf community, whereby the Australian surf community really kicked off in part because of the movie Gidget and the American surf community, and then picked up on that movement and brought it over here. But like all things American, kind of don't want to think about those American links. And in fact, that's why the word seppo for septic yank, septic tank, that comes from the surf community. It first pops up in the surfy mags. So what we imagine must have happened here is we must have triggered his American spidey senses, and he might have pushed back on this. But the point here is that the closer we get to the heart of a cultural identity, the more difficult it might actually be to pull them away from these ideas. But what we did notice seems to work. I'm sorry to illustrate here. What's interesting is when we get into the comment section, people might actually not accept us as epistemic authorities, and that people might actually go, well, here's another person. I happen to have this personal experience of this word, and I'm not going to accept what you say because it kind of doesn't jive with my personal experience. Now, where do we find some movement when identity becomes relevant is whenever we really, really hit them with outside epistemic authority. And what I mean by this is if somebody pushes back on something, and this is a slightly different example, of course, but this commenter, again, a throwaway comment. I think a lot of our comments actually come from just things that we're just kind of going, well, this will be artsy. And we dropped in a Lucky D at the start of the summertime slang piece. And this commenter says, Lucky D sounds like something East Coast British expats might say. I've not heard it in South Australia. And another commenter jumps in, and we were talking about personal experience, says, well, maybe it's just that we've had fewer Lucky Ds in Australia, that we've not actually heard this term. And Kate pops up and actually I think does something that's really, really effective, actually shows a strong epistemic source, which is Sue Butler's blog, and Sue Butler talking about this term, but also includes a cultural reference, which is Sammy J's Ballad of Lochie Dee. So it establishes it, even if it's not an Australianism, that it's used in Australia. It's not something that we're pulling from a British context to do this. Now, what's interesting here, though, is the commenter gets back in, says, oh, thanks, but I see that Sue wrote it was inherited from the UK. So she's hanging on a little bit to her original stance, but that's totally fine. She's not actually wrong. So what does our summary here tell us? Well, it tells us that deeply held beliefs that are wrapped up in cultural identity can be difficult to change. Censor that so you don't have to see it, Lauren, sorry. We should focus our energy, on those people that we actually might have an ability to change the minds of, or to modify and calibrate the perspectives of. Oftentimes, or we should remember that that's actually a majority of society. We can get obsessed with those people that will never be convinced, but in fact, arguably, the majority of society might actually be convincible and swayable. We can't presume our epistemic authority in public context. So we have to keep that in mind. Just because we think that we're the experts, the public understanding of science model is gone for a lot of people. The democratization of science is here. We've got to figure out what that means for us. We should also recognize that people have come to believe what they believe for a reason. And we should probably work a little bit harder to understand what those reasons are. And if we're making a big point and we want people to get the big points, sometimes it's all right to let them win on the smaller points. Yeah, if I can sway you that Lochie Dee is used in Australia, you can have your British origin etymology, because we're not 100% sure either. So the third and final point here to make is about language and a certain aesthetic je ne sais quoi that it has, that we linguists maybe overlook. And in a way, I wrote the section, so I'll do it, but I owe this point to Kate, because she's been pointing this out for a while in our conversations. So language has an aesthetic quality. How we come to that aesthetic quality is entirely based on where we come from, what we know about language, those kinds of things. So our ability to recognize, for instance, a Dada piece of art or a particular piece of art from Australian history is entirely driven by our understanding of what that art does. What was the Dada movement doing? Why are people offended by this particular landscape? It comes from a period in Australian painting when, the newcomers were trying to make the Australian landscape look like Europe. So this painting would actually offend some people if you knew that background. And what's interesting and kind of inspiring for me, at least sometimes when I dip into the comments, is the fact that people recognize that there is a scientific, some people recognize there is a scientific and aesthetic side to what we're doing. And this commenter stuck out. I don't think that anyone could seriously maintain that language doesn't change over time. Thank you, sir. And as this thread demonstrates, people have different attitudes towards the change. Oh my God, you get it. Simple assertions of preference are not impermissible, but they don't take the debate much further, rather like a child's assertion that I don't like cabbage. So you can see that some people are actually recognizing that there's a bit of complexity to the issue. And this comment of the many stuck out too, because this comment suggests, well, maybe linguists are in slight overreaction to things that are happening in the community. But it's the arrogant snobbery of previous generations of pedantic educators who did their best to deceive us that Silvertail English was the purest and best of English language. So you can see that maybe, I love this because I feel like he saw me. We might be overreacting, but there's a reason why we're overreacting. And that brings us to these final two quotes here that come from Kate and Catherine, is it? Article on H or H. And these two individuals kind of cut to the heart of this idea of aesthetics, I thought it seems like from the sheer number of comments in this article that there are a lot of us who think that languages are great fun. I look forward to reading Kate's articles and all the comments that they occasion. And a similar vibe there, but the point is that we actually, by doing what we do, create the context for people to celebrate the gift of language and this aesthetic aspect of language. And I think we should understand and kind of embrace that we do create that space, and Lauren creates it perhaps better than many of us, or most of us, but a creative space for people to be enthusiastic and love language, and we should embrace this. So a summary of this section, and then I'll wrap up and we can have a bit of a discussion here. Language has an aesthetic quality. I don't think any of us can reject that idea, and perhaps one that we linguists underestimate at times. This actually creates a wonderful niche for us to explain why language is the way it is and how people can appreciate it in more informed ways. Perhaps we don't have to play whack-a-mole. Maybe we waste a lot of energy playing whack-a-mole if people don't get things exactly right. After all, things get pretty funky downstream from our lab. So ending up with a couple of final conclusions here, language clearly has an aesthetic quality for the public and us as members of the public too. As with any aesthetic objects, its evaluation is grounded in personal experience, culture, and trend. As Simon showed aptly in a discussion of contentious topics, like prescriptivism versus non-contentious topics like Australian slang, less contentious topics like Australian slang. Evaluation takes place in communal ways, but sometimes in enjoined ways. And we have to recognize that different topics kind of invoke different ways of thinking about language. And we linguists provide the context for enjoying language, but also informing the public. We're trying to persuade, but maybe one way that we need to be working harder at is to actually recognize that we ourselves are language connoisseurs too. And we're happy to take any questions.
Well, I have portable speaker, but it requires a set of Bluetooth. So
No, I think we're all